I didn't call for a plumber, Victoria Blake snapped, her voice echoing through the marble penthouse. I called for someone who could actually fix this before my entire night is ruined. Ethan Miller stood in the doorway with a weathered tool bag in one hand and a tired patience in the other, the kind that only came from years of carrying more than his share of bad days. He had been awake since before sunrise, dropped his little daughter Sophie off with a neighbor, rushed across the city in a van that sounded like it was held together by prayer, and now he was standing under crystal chandeliers being judged in under 5 seconds by a woman who lived on a different planet than the one he came from. Water was dripping somewhere behind the walls, slow and steady, like a countdown no one could stop. The penthouse smelled faintly of expensive perfume, fresh paint, and panic. Victoria Blake, CEO of Blake Holdings, moved across the room in sharp heels and sharper frustration, her phone clutched in one hand while the other pointed toward the ceiling. "Do you even understand what you're looking at?" she asked, not bothering to hide the disbelief in her tone. Around her stood Mark Reynolds, the building manager, and Daniel Cross, the engineering consultant who had already spent 2 hours assessing the problem. Neither of them looked relieved to see Ethan. If anything, they looked insulted that a man in work boots had been called in after the polished experts had failed. Mark gave a faint, almost pitying smile. Daniel barely glanced at Ethan before returning his attention to the notes in his tablet, as if the plumber was just another inconvenient detail in an already embarrassing evening. Ethan didn't react. He had learned a long time ago that people like to talk first and think later, especially when they see a single dad in a faded work shirt standing in a room worth more than most homes. He set his bag down carefully, listened to the soft, irregular tapping behind the wall, and slowly looked toward the ceiling with an expression so calm it almost made Victoria more irritated. "I can understand enough to know this didn't start tonight," Ethan said at last, his voice even, almost quiet. That answer only made Victoria narrow her eyes. "That's very impressive," she said dryly, "because the last 3 people here told me the exact opposite. They said it was a minor pressure issue. Then they said it was probably the valves. Then they said it was nothing urgent." Ethan glanced toward the wall again, then back at her. They were wrong. The room went still for a beat. Not because anyone agreed with him, but because he had said it without flinching, without selling himself, without trying to sound important. There was something irritatingly certain about him, something that didn't match the image Victoria had already built in her head. And beneath that steady surface, Ethan was already piecing together the shape of the problem. The sound in the walls wasn't random. The pressure fluctuation wasn't random. The smell of damp plaster near the east corner wasn't random either. Something deeper was failing, and if he was right, the elegant penthouse above the city was sitting on top of a mistake that could turn this glamorous evening into a disaster before midnight. Victoria folded her arms and gave Ethan a look that had ended board meetings and buried competitors. "If you're about to tell me what my engineers missed, you should probably remember that they have degrees, and you have a wrench." The words hung in the air with polished cruelty, the kind that sounded clean only because it had been practiced so many times before. Mark Reynolds shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, while Daniel Cross lifted his chin just enough to show he agreed, without saying it out loud. Ethan crouched beside the baseboard anyway and opened his tool bag with slow, deliberate movements. He did not rush. He did not defend himself. He simply listened again to the faint, almost rhythmic sound inside the wall, then placed 2 fingers against the plaster and felt the vibration travel up his hand. Something was building behind that surface, something the others had either ignored or never bothered to trace far enough. "I'm not here to argue about credentials," Ethan said. "I'm here because this place is leaking from somewhere it shouldn't be." Victoria let out a short laugh. "Welcome to the obvious." Ethan looked up, and for the first time she noticed that his eyes were not tired in the way she expected. They were tired in the way of a man who had already survived too much to be rattled by a stranger's contempt. "No," he said quietly. "The obvious is the drip. The real problem is what caused it." That made Daniel step forward. "You've been here for less than 10 minutes. And you've been here for hours," Ethan replied, not looking at him. "So maybe that's the difference." The line landed harder than anyone wanted to admit. Victoria's jaw tightened. She was used to being the smartest person in the room, or at least the one everyone treated like it. The idea that a man who arrived in a dented work van and carried a child's doodle clipped inside his wallet could speak with that much confidence irritated her more than she cared to understand. Ethan pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, aimed it along the edge of the cabinetry, then pressed lightly near a seam few people would have noticed. A dull hollow sound answered back. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "There," he murmured. "That's where they stopped looking." Daniel frowned. "It's just insulation." "No," Ethan said. "It's a panel covering access to a second line." Mark blinked. "A second line?" Ethan nodded once. "Illegal or poorly documented, I can't tell yet. But somebody routed an older feed through the east wall and tied it into the main system. That would explain the pressure spike, the repeated dripping, and why every quick fix failed." Victoria stared at him. "You're saying this building was designed badly?" "I'm saying this room was patched badly," Ethan answered. "And patched badly enough to hide the truth." The confidence in his voice changed the temperature of the penthouse. For the first time, even Daniel looked uncertain. Ethan stood, reached into his bag, and removed a narrow inspection camera. He fed it carefully into the gap he had found, his movements calm, precise, and almost unnervingly sure. On the tiny screen, the problem began to reveal itself piece by piece. Corrosion, old fittings, mismatched piping, and a dark trail of moisture where no one had expected it. Victoria's expression shifted just slightly. Not enough to be called respect. Not yet, but enough to show that doubt had cracked open. And through that crack, Ethan Miller had already stepped farther than anyone had expected him to go. The image on the inspection screen made the room feel smaller. Ethan shifted the angle of the camera, and everyone leaned in despite themselves. A second later, a faint crackling sound came through the wall, then a sharper hiss, like a warning whispered by the building itself. Victoria took an involuntary step back. "What is that?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was studying the feed with the focus of someone reading a language other people had never bothered to learn. "That," he said at last, "is a failing bypass line." Daniel Cross scoffed under his breath. "Impossible. We inspected the main system." "You inspected what was easy to reach," Ethan said. His tone was not rude, but it carried something worse, certainty. He moved the camera a few inches deeper, and the screen flickered with a section of piping so corroded it looked older than the penthouse itself. There were crude joints where there should have been seamless fittings, sealant applied in uneven layers, and a secondary route that had clearly been hidden behind the wall long before tonight. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "This was never just a pressure issue," he said. "Someone tied an outdated feed into the current line and buried it. Every time the system spikes, this section takes the hit." Mark Reynolds wiped a hand down the side of his face. "Can you fix it?" Ethan looked up at him, then toward Victoria, who was trying very hard to remain composed. "I can stabilize it," he said. "But if I'm right about how this was routed, you're one bad surge away from flooding half the floor." The words landed like a stone in still water. Victoria's expression hardened. "You're telling me the engineers missed something this dangerous?" Ethan gently withdrew the camera, coiled the cable, and set the tool beside his bag. "I'm telling you they either missed it," he said, "or they didn't want to know what was behind the wall." Daniel's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation. So is hiding a problem that can damage an entire penthouse." Ethan glanced at the drip near the ceiling and then at the widening patch of moisture near the east corner. The warning signs were already there. That's why the odor started. That's why the pressure keeps bouncing. That's why the leak isn't getting better no matter how many quick adjustments you make. For the first time, Victoria didn't interrupt. She watched him as he spoke, and though she would have hated admitting it, she was beginning to realize that his calm wasn't arrogance. It was familiarity. He had seen systems fail before. He understood how one small mistake could hide inside a perfect-looking space until it became impossible to ignore. Ethan crouched again and slid a gloved hand along the base of the wall, stopping when he felt a faint vibration. "There's heat building behind here," he said. "Not enough yet to be visible, but enough to tell me the line is under stress." Mark's eyes widened. "Heat? From water? From friction and pressure?" Ethan replied. "If that bypass line bursts, you'll have more than a leak." He stood slowly, his tool bag hanging at his side like it had weight far beyond metal and screws. "You'll have a disaster." Nobody spoke for a moment. Even Daniel had gone quiet, his tablet lowered at last. Victoria looked from the wall to Ethan, then back again, her mind visibly running through the consequences. Her event downstairs was supposed to begin in less than an hour. Investors, donors, cameras, and half the city's elite were arriving soon. And now this plumber, this single father in a worn shirt and scuffed boots, was telling her the glamorous penthouse she had used to intimidate people was sitting on top of a hidden failure no one else had been smart enough to notice. For the first time since he arrived, Victoria Blake was not annoyed. She was worried. Victoria turned away from the wall and walked a few steps toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the city lights outside might somehow help her regain control of the room. She pressed her fingers to her temple, exhaled once, then looked back at Ethan with the kind of restraint that came from being too proud to panic in front of people. "How long?" she asked. "How long do we have before this becomes what you're making it sound like?" Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. "Depends on how much pressure the system takes in the next hour." Daniel Cross gave a sharp, disbelieving shake of his head. "An hour? That's absurd. If the line were really that compromised, we'd have seen a visible failure already." Ethan met his gaze with calm patience. "You did see it. You just called it something smaller." The answer made Daniel's face flush. Mark Reynolds rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the staircase leading down to the main event level. "Victoria, if he's right, we need to stop the guests from using the upper plumbing immediately." "I know that," Victoria snapped, then immediately softened her tone when she heard the edge in her own voice. She hated that she was being forced into a conversation where a plumber in a faded work shirt was now the only person speaking with certainty. Yet the more Ethan explained, the more impossible it became to dismiss him. He pointed to the wall and began mapping the issue in a voice that was steady but urgent, describing how the hidden bypass line had likely been installed years ago during a rushed renovation. The old feed was never properly removed. It had simply been buried and forgotten, then tied awkwardly into the newer system to save time and money. "That kind of shortcut works until it doesn't," he said. "And tonight it's reaching the point where it won't." Victoria crossed her arms again, but this time the motion was less defensive and more like she needed something to hold on to. "If you're wrong," she said, "you're going to cost me an entire evening and embarrass my team." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "If I'm wrong, your floor gets wet. If I'm right, this penthouse gets flooded." That settled the room for a second. Even Daniel had no immediate answer. Ethan opened his bag and began laying out the tools with measured precision, each one placed where he could reach it without wasting emotion. There was no dramatic flourish in what he did, no attempt to impress. He simply worked like someone who knew the difference between noise and action. "I need access to the service panel," he said, "and I need everyone else to stay out of my way." Mark nodded quickly and moved toward the hallway to fetch maintenance keys. But Victoria didn't move. She kept watching Ethan, as if some new equation had appeared in front of her and she was struggling to accept the result. "You're awfully sure of yourself?" she said quietly. "No," Ethan replied, not looking up. "I'm sure of the damage this can do." That answer landed harder than any boast would have. It was the kind of line that came from experience, from nights spent fixing things other people had ignored until they became emergencies. Ethan slipped on a fresh pair of gloves and reached for the wall access tools. But before he could start, a low shudder moved through the plumbing behind the plaster. It was subtle, almost easy to miss. Yet everyone in the room felt it. A tiny tremor. A warning. Ethan froze for half a second, his head tilted toward the sound. Then he looked up slowly and said, "That wasn't there a minute ago." Victoria's face changed. "What does that mean?" Ethan's eyes narrowed, and for the first time his calm looked sharpened by concern. "It means the system just shifted." He stood, listening to the building as if it had spoken directly to him, while beyond the penthouse walls the city continued glowing like nothing was wrong. But inside that room, the atmosphere had changed completely. This was no longer about a leak or a bad repair. Something was moving deeper inside the structure, and Ethan was now the only person who seemed to understand that the next few minutes would decide whether the penthouse stayed standing or became the site of a very expensive mistake. The second the shutter passed through the wall, Ethan moved. Not quickly in a frantic way, but with the sharp economy of someone who had spent years learning that hesitation turns small problems into expensive disasters. He stepped to the east corner, crouched, and pressed his palm against the paneling. The vibration was stronger now, a low pulse that seemed to crawl under the paint. "Everyone back," he said. Victoria blinked. "What? Back?" Ethan repeated, louder this time. Mark immediately obeyed, pulling Daniel with him a few steps away, but Victoria stayed where she was, her expression caught between irritation and rising alarm. Ethan reached for a narrow pry tool, slid it into the seam he had found earlier, and applied pressure. For a moment nothing happened. Then the panel shifted with a faint crack, and a thin wave of damp air pushed out from the hidden space behind the wall. The smell was worse than before, metallic, stale, and unmistakably wrong. Victoria's eyes widened. Ethan pulled the panel open just enough to reveal a narrow service cavity packed with old piping, faded insulation, and a line of patched joints that looked like they had been layered over by several different crews over several different years. It was a mess. Not the kind of mess that happened by accident, but the kind created when people tried to hide a problem from the people above them. Daniel stepped closer despite himself. "That can't be original construction," he muttered. Ethan gave him a look. "No, it's a cover-up." He leaned in and traced the hidden line with a gloved finger, stopping where the pipe had been wrapped in an extra seal that was already blistering under pressure. "This is the weak point," he said. "The whole system is loading against this section." Victoria stared into the cavity and then at the tools in Ethan's hands. "Can you isolate it?" "Yes," he said, "but I need to cut the bypass and drain the pressure before it bursts." Mark swallowed. "How long will that take?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He was studying the way the pipe flexed as the water moved through it. "Not long if nothing goes wrong," he said at last. Which usually means something will. The bluntness of that statement should have been funny. Instead, it sent a cold line through the room. Victoria finally crossed the distance to stand beside him, though she kept a careful half-step back as if she still wasn't ready to trust what she was seeing. "You're telling me the engineers missed this completely?" she asked. Ethan reached into his bag for a valve key. "I'm telling you they either didn't open the right wall, or they didn't want to admit this section was hiding a problem bigger than a simple leak." Daniel bristled. "That's not fair." "Fair doesn't matter when a pipe blows through concrete," Ethan said. He slipped the key onto the valve, turned it slowly, and the entire cavity answered with a deeper rattle. The sound made Victoria flinch. Ethan noticed and immediately tightened his grip. "There," he said. "That's the load shifting." He glanced at the floor, then at the ceiling, calculating pressure the way another man might read the weather. "If we don't stop this now, the burst won't stay in the wall." That sentence changed the mood completely. Mark stared at him. I mean it could come through the bathroom, the hallway, maybe even the reception area below if the line gives out hard enough." Victoria's face went pale. Her event was not downstairs anymore in her mind. It was in danger. Investors, donors, photographers, and half the city's elite were all waiting only one floor below, unaware that their polished evening was sitting under a hidden flood risk nobody had seen coming. Ethan didn't waste time on panic. He reached into the cavity, adjusted the seal by less than an inch, and then paused as another sound came through the wall. This one a loud, wet knock, followed by a thin hiss. He froze. Everyone froze. His eyes narrowed. "That's the pressure release," he said quietly. "And it's coming faster than I expected." Victoria turned toward him fully now, all the arrogance from earlier stripped away and replaced by something much more dangerous. Trust. Not complete. Not yet. But enough to make her voice drop when she asked, "Can you stop it?" Ethan looked at the wall, then at the tool in his hand, then at the hidden piping that had fooled people with degrees and credentials. When he spoke, there was no boasting in it. Only the hard certainty of a man who had no choice but to be right. "Yes," he said, "but once I start, there's no going back." Victoria didn't hesitate this time. "Then do it." The words came out fast, almost too fast, like she was trying to outrun the fear rising in her own chest. Ethan nodded once, no wasted motion, no speech about confidence. Or timing. He tightened his grip on the valve key, braced one shoulder against the open cavity, and began the shutdown sequence with the controlled focus of a man who had done this in worse conditions and with less at stake. The metal groaned as he turned the mechanism. A hard vibration kicked through the wall, deeper and louder than before, and for a second everyone in the room thought the pipe had already given way. Mark cursed under his breath. Daniel took a step back. Victoria stayed still, staring at Ethan's hands as if they were the only stable thing in the penthouse. Ethan ignored all of it. He was listening to the system the way a musician listens to a note that's about to break. "Pressure is dropping," he said. "Not enough yet. Keep clear." He adjusted again, slower this time, then reached in and snapped a secondary clamp onto the line. The hiss changed pitch. The room held its breath with him. Then came the moment that proved everything. A sharp burst of water slammed against the inside of the cavity, not enough to flood the room, but enough to reveal how close they had been to disaster. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Victoria flinched despite herself. Ethan didn't. He had already anticipated it. "That's it," he said. "That's the surge I was waiting for." He moved immediately, cutting the bypass cleanly, then redirecting the remaining flow through a temporary channel he had built in seconds with parts from his bag. It was the kind of solution that looked simple only after someone had already done the impossible. His hands were steady, his breathing measured, and his face showed none of the strain that everyone else was feeling for him. Daniel stared at the open wall, stunned into silence. The arrogant certainty that had filled him earlier was gone now, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he had been wrong in exactly the way Ethan had warned him about. The hidden line gave one final shudder, then slowly, mercifully, stopped fighting back. Ethan held the clamp in place for 3 more seconds, then another 2, just to make sure. When he finally released it, the entire room seemed to exhale. The drip above the ceiling stopped. The vibration faded. Even the air felt different, less tense, less charged. For the first time since Ethan arrived, no one spoke over him. Victoria looked from the wall to Ethan's face and then back again, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and reluctant awe. "It's over?" she asked. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth and stood slowly. "For now," he said. "But you'll want that whole section replaced. What's in there is old enough to fail again if anyone touches it wrong." Mark let out a shaky breath and leaned one hand against the doorway. "You just saved this floor." Ethan gave a small shrug, as if he were only finishing a task he had been hired to do. But Victoria saw the truth in the way he carried himself. There was no pride in the performance. No need for applause. He had simply seen the problem before everyone else and refused to pretend it was smaller than it was. She glanced toward Daniel, whose face had gone rigid with embarrassment. The man who had walked in under a cloud of doubt now stood in the center of the penthouse as the only reason it hadn't turned into a catastrophe. Victoria looked back at Ethan, her voice quieter now. "How did you see it when no one else did?" Ethan gathered his tools and closed the bag with a soft click. "Because people kept treating the visible problem instead of asking what was hidden under it," he said. "Most failures don't announce themselves. They hide behind whatever looks easiest to blame." The answer landed with more force than a lecture ever could. Victoria didn't speak for a moment. She simply watched him, and for the first time, the distance between them didn't feel like money or status. It felt like the difference between someone who assumed the world was built to protect her and someone who knew it could fall apart without warning. And tonight, the man she had mocked had been the one standing between her and that fall. The silence after the repair felt heavier than the noise had. No one in the penthouse moved for a few seconds, as if everyone needed proof that the danger had really passed. Then Mark let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for the better part of an hour, and Daniel lowered his tablet with a look that made it clear his earlier confidence had been permanently damaged. Ethan closed his bag and checked the wall one more time, but only out of habit. The pressure had stabilized. The hidden line had been isolated. For the moment, the penthouse was safe. Victoria stepped closer, not all the way, but enough to make it obvious that the distance between them had changed. Her expression was no longer sharp. It was unsettled. "You were right," she said, and the words sounded strange in her mouth, like something she wasn't used to giving away freely. Ethan gave a small nod, neither smug nor eager. He had heard apologies from people with less money and more grace, and he knew better than to expect one from a woman like Victoria Blake. But to her credit, she kept going. "I assumed the problem was basic," she said. "I assumed everyone who came in before you understood what they were doing. And I assumed you'd be no different." The last part came out quieter, more honest. Daniel looked away, clearly wishing he could disappear into the marble floor. Victoria didn't spare him a glance. Her attention stayed on Ethan, as if she had finally recognized that the real authority in the room was not the person who owned it, but the person who knew how to keep it from failing. "I owe you an apology," she said. Ethan stood there for a moment, the tool bag hanging from his hand, his shirt marked by dust, and the faint smell of metal and damp plaster. He had spent enough years being underestimated to know that a quick apology was often just a way to feel better without changing anything. So he said nothing right away. That silence made Victoria uncomfortable, which only proved how serious she was. "I shouldn't have spoken to you like that," she added. "And I definitely shouldn't have dismissed you before you even started." Ethan looked toward the wall, then back at her. "No," he said. "You shouldn't have." The directness of the answer made her blink. But he wasn't being cruel. He was simply refusing to pretend the moment was softer than it had been. That honesty mattered more than a polished line. It made the apology real. Victoria nodded once, accepting the sting of it. "Still," she said, "you saved this room from a disaster." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I did my job." "No," she said, and this time her voice held something closer to respect. "You did what people with higher paychecks and bigger titles failed to do." Daniel's jaw tightened at that, but he said nothing. Mark, sensing the change in the room, quietly stepped back and pretended to check the hallway. Victoria rubbed her hands together, suddenly unsure where to put them, and Ethan noticed that for the first time she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had just been forced to confront her own assumptions in front of everyone. "There's more work that needs to be done," Ethan said, already back in problem-solving mode. "This fix is temporary. If you want the line properly replaced, you'll need a full shutdown and a structural inspection." Victoria nodded quickly. "You'll handle it." It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He thought of Sophie waiting at home, probably asking the neighbor when Dad would be back. He thought of the long day still ahead, of the bills, the van, the tiredness in his bones. And then he looked at the penthouse, at the people who had laughed at him, at the woman who had finally stopped doing that, and he understood that this was no longer just a repair. It was a doorway. Victoria seemed to read the hesitation. "Name your price," she said. Ethan zipped his bag closed and gave her a steady look. "My price is simple," he replied. "Next time someone like me walks into a room, you don't decide what he knows before he opens his mouth." The answer landed harder than a demand for money ever could. Victoria held his gaze for a beat, then nodded slowly. It was not full redemption. Not yet. But it was the first honest crack in the wall between them. And for Ethan Miller, that was enough to turn one ruined evening into the beginning of something neither of them had expected. By the time the rest of the crew arrived, the mood in the penthouse had changed so completely it felt like a different room. The air was calmer now, but not comfortable. It was the kind of calm that came after a storm had passed and left. Everyone staring at the damage they had ignored. Ethan stood near the service wall, explaining the next steps to Mark in a voice that was steady and practical, while Daniel remained silent beside the doorway, clearly wishing the floor would open and swallow him. Victoria listened without interrupting, and that alone would have been enough to shock anyone who knew her. She had spent the last 10 minutes doing something no one in her circle probably expected from her, paying attention. Really paying attention. Not to defend herself, not to regain control, but to understand. Ethan walked her through the replacement plan, the hidden line, the need for a full inspection, and the risks of leaving even a small portion of the old system in place. He spoke plainly, without ego, and the more he explained, the more obvious it became that he wasn't just skilled. He was deeply experienced. Not the kind of experience that comes from textbooks or polished presentations, but the kind earned through real work, real mistakes, and real responsibility. When he finished, Victoria looked at the damaged wall and then back at him. "You handled that like it was nothing," she said quietly. Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "It was something. I just didn't have the luxury of acting like it wasn't." That answer hit harder than she expected. For a second, she saw him not as the man in the work boots, but as someone who had likely spent years making impossible things look manageable because no one else was going to step in and do them for him. A man raising a child alone. A man who had probably learned that panic wastes time, and time costs money, and money costs comfort. And comfort is something you don't get to rely on when life keeps taking shortcuts around you. Victoria felt the weight of that realization settle in her chest. It was not pity. It was something more uncomfortable and more honest. Respect. Real respect. The kind that comes only after someone forces you to admit you were wrong. "Ethan," she said, and for once his name came out without any of the sharpness it had carried earlier. He looked up. "I'm serious when I say I owe you," she continued. "Not just for tonight. For the way I treated you from the moment you walked in." Ethan didn't rush to forgive her. He simply listened. That, more than anything, made her speak more carefully. "I was arrogant," she said, "and impatient, and I made assumptions because I thought I could afford to." The room went quiet around them. Even the other men seemed to sense that this was no longer about pipes or pressure or repairs. It was about a boundary crossing that had finally been named. Ethan nodded once, accepting the truth of it without handing out the comfort of immediate absolution. Victoria took a breath and then said the words that made the atmosphere shift again. "I'd like to make this right," she said. "Not with a token apology. I mean properly. Whatever your rate is, I'll pay it. And if you're willing, I'd like you to stay on as our consulting plumber for all building issues going forward." Mark's eyes widened. Daniel looked even more miserable. Ethan remained still, considering the offer. He had not come here looking for recognition, much less a new contract. But the sincerity in her voice was real now. No performance. No polished corporate rescue. Just a woman who had been forced to see the person she had dismissed and was trying, awkwardly, to step back from the edge of her own pride. Before Ethan could answer, Sophie's face flashed briefly in his mind. Her smile, the way she believed he could fix anything, even when he was exhausted. He thought of the extra money that could mean stability. Then he thought of the principle. Recognition mattered. Not because it fed ego, but because it told the next man in worn boots that he deserved to be heard too. Ethan lifted his gaze to Victoria. "I'll consider the offer," he said. "But only if you understand this isn't about making me feel important." Victoria nodded immediately. "I understand." And for the first time since he walked into the penthouse, Ethan believed her. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan stepped out carrying his tool bag the same way he had walked in, quietly, without asking the room for permission. But this time, the people in the lobby looked at him differently. The building staff who had once ignored him now nodded. One of the younger maintenance guys even stepped aside with a kind of awkward respect, as if he had just watched someone rewrite the rules of the place without raising his voice once. Ethan didn't linger. He had a daughter waiting for him at home, and that mattered more than any penthouse, any apology, or any admiration he might have earned upstairs. Still, as he crossed the polished floor toward the exit, he heard footsteps behind him. Victoria Blake caught up before he reached the doors. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the city filtered in through the glass, distant horns and rushing traffic mixing with the quiet hum of the building. Victoria stood there in her immaculate suit, but for the first time she seemed less like the woman who ran the entire property and more like someone trying to say something she had never practiced before. "I meant what I said," she told him. Ethan adjusted the strap of his bag. "About the contract?" "About everything," she replied. "You were right when you said I judged you before you even spoke. I've spent a lot of my life believing that the people in charge are the ones who know best. Tonight proved I was wrong." Ethan studied her for a moment. There was no smirk on her face now, no polished defense, no trace of the woman who had mocked him in front of a room full of people. What remained was honesty, and that made him far less interested in punishing her than he might have been an hour ago. "People like to confuse title with skill," he said. "You're not the first person who's done it." Victoria nodded slowly. "I won't be the last unless I change it." That earned the faintest shift in Ethan's expression, almost a smile, but not quite. Victoria took a breath, then reached into her bag and handed him a business card. "If you'll let me, I'd like to hire you properly. Not as a favor, not as charity. As the man who saved this building from a failure no one else caught." Ethan accepted the card but didn't look at it right away. He only tucked it into his pocket. "I'll send you a full inspection report," he said, "and a replacement plan for the whole section." "Good," Victoria said. "And Ethan?" He looked up. "Thank you." This time the words sounded real. Not dramatic, not performative, just honest. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Victoria stepped back and gave him the space to leave. As Ethan walked toward the door, he thought about how the evening had started. A tired single dad showing up to a luxury penthouse and being treated like he had no business being there. He thought about the dripping wall, the hidden piping, the voices that laughed too soon. And he thought about the moment everything changed, not because he yelled louder, not because he tried to prove himself, but because he did the work and let the truth speak for itself. Outside, the night air hit his face like freedom. His van waited at the curb, old and dented and loyal in a way the Penthouse could never understand. Ethan climbed in, started the engine, and for the first time all night, felt the weight in his shoulders ease. He had not just fixed a leak. He had walked into a room built on assumptions and left it with respect. Back upstairs, Victoria stood in the lobby for a long time after he was gone, staring at the doors like she expected them to open again. But they didn't. And for the first time in a very long time, she understood something she should have known all along. The people who are easiest to overlook are often the ones holding everything together.